Isn't it grand to be a Christian? Isn't it grand and wonderful to be here at the Concord Street congregation? I am so thankful that each and every one of you are here. We appreciate our members being here, but we also want to welcome our visitors that are with us, and we're very thankful that you are here also this morning. If you have opportunity, it'd be great if you would fill out one of the yellow cards you might find in the back of the pew in front of you, and that way we can have a record of your attendance, and you can just leave that on your pew as you leave, or drop it in one of the contribution boxes, or hand it to somebody that looks like they need to have it. And that way we can have a record of your attendance. I appreciate the wonderful way we've been able to worship together this morning. I appreciate Philip in leading our songs for Jermaine and his prayer. And I really appreciate him praying for me. We covet your prayers. Please, let's make sure we all strive to pray for one another. We can have the names of our brothers and sisters on our hearts and bring those names before the throne of God. That is so very important for each and every one of us. Appreciate Anthony and leading our minds around the Lord's table, and for Jaden in reading our passage that we're going to be looking at. In fact, if you want to turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2, and we'll be reading this passage again just for emphasis' sake. So we've been walking through the Gospel of Mark, and as we are walking through the Gospel of Mark, I am hopefully trying to bring out some things that maybe you have not thought about before, and also with the whole theme that we want to be people that are cruciformed, people that have lives that are shaped by the cross. And what the Gospel of Mark does, that good news about the kingdom, is it tells us the story of this one individual who has his entire life shaped by the cross. And as he goes throughout his life, he invites others to follow him in that same way, and that way leads to that cross. And so we will eventually, as we go through the Gospel of Mark, we are all headed towards chapter 15, where we have the crucifixion, and chapter 16, where there is the resurrection, and it leaves it open for you to make a decision about your own life. But let's look at Mark chapter 2, and we're in the midst of some conflict stories in the Gospel of Mark. Okay? We started this in chapter 2 and in verse 1 with the healing of the paralyzed man that was let down by his 4 friends. Then we had the conflict of Jesus going to him calling that tax collector, those sinners, and eating with them, if you will. Look what it says here starting in verse 18. It says, "The disciples of John and of the Pharisees were fasting. Then they came to him and said to him, 'Why do the disciples of John and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?' And Jesus said to them, 'Can the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom be taken away from them, then they will fast in those days.'" Now, look at verse 21. "No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, or else the new piece pulls away from the old, and the tear is made worse. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine bursts the wineskins, and the wine is spilled, and the wineskins are ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins." As I was studying this section of Scripture, here's the question that I came up with. What do these parables have to do with fasting? What in the world does talking about new wine and new wineskins, or talking about an old cloth and new cloth, what does that have to do with fasting? I don't know. It seems to be totally out of place. Here we had this conversation where he's asked, why don't y'all fast like the other people fast? And he says, hey, guess what? If you're sewing a garment, don't take some new cloth and put it on old cloth. Okay, that makes perfect sense, right? Well, maybe what's happening here is that Mark is using something in the structure of his gospel to try to get your attention, to try to make you see something that is important. Okay, one of the features that we find in Old Testament and New Testament is this idea of a chiastic structure. All right, so this is a big fancy word, chiastic, which basically just means X. All right, a chiasm or a chiasm comes from the Greek letter X, what we think about X, or chi or chi, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Okay, that is what that Greek letter is. And so this is a literary device that is used in the Old Testament, it's used in the New Testament. It is something that was familiar to the people where you would have inverted parallelism. All right? And this is what that means. So you'd have a structure that would go A, B, C, and then there would be another B that corresponds to that B, and there would be another A that corresponds to that A. And then the focus, the important part, not that the other parts aren't important, but the important part that he's trying to get your eyes to focus in on is the middle of that X. So it would go like this. You would have story 1 would correspond with another story 1. Story 2 would correspond with another story 2. And then that middle story would be the focus. It is my opinion that this is what Mark is trying to do in these conflict stories, okay? In this conflict chiasm, if you will, where he has 5 different stories about conflict starting here in Mark chapter 2. And they correspond with one another. You have the healing of the paralyzed man in chapter 2 and in verses 1 through 12, and that directly corresponds with the healing of another person who is paralyzed, if you will, but this time has a paralyzed hand. So we have a healing story and a healing story. The second story is about Jesus eating with the sinners. Remember, it was him who called Levi, and they are having this banquet, they are having this feast, and he is gathered by all these other sinners. He is eating with them. That's the focus. He is eating. Well, that corresponds with another story, the beginning of chapter 3, where Jesus, his disciples, are eating on the Sabbath. Not that you couldn't eat on the Sabbath, but the way they were doing it, where they were plucking grain, the people were upset about. But it's another eating story, which falls in line now that this middle story is this question about fasting. And we have these 2 random parables, it seems, that are just attached to this question. And so what Mark perhaps is trying to do, and the other gospel writers follow suit with Mark too, is maybe is trying to get you to focus in on these parables. Okay? And so that's what I want to do this morning too, is let's focus in on these 2 parables that Jesus is bringing up, okay, in this conflict stories that are taking place, and see what kind of lessons we can learn from it. Okay? So, the question is not so much a question about fasting as it is a question about fitting in. Notice our text again. Look there in Mark and in chapter 2. And notice what is said there, starting in verse 18 again. It says, the disciples of John and of the Pharisees were fasting. Okay, he lays the groundwork there that there is 2 different groups of people. There's the disciples of John, referring to John the Baptist, and there's also the disciples of the Pharisees, or the group of the people who are the Pharisees. Both of those movements, both of those groups, they are fasting. But Jesus' movement, Jesus' disciples, they are not fasting. And so that's the question. It's not so much about why are you not fasting as if why are you not fitting in with the other movements that are going on. You see, John the Baptist's followers, they fast. The Pharisees, they fast. Well, why don't y'all fast too? Why don't y'all just fit right into the other structures that are there? So John's disciples fast, Pharisees fast, but why don't you fit in to these same structures? Why don't you fit in to the same things that are supposed to be happening? Because if you really are a religious movement, then guess what religious movements do? They fast. But you're not doing that. Why aren't you doing that? And so Jesus starts to answer this question by first of all answering about fasting. He says, we fast out of grief. We fast out of sorrow. But right now, the bridegroom, this is not a time for grief. It's not a time for sorrow, because that which they have been waiting on is right there with them. This is a time of celebration. This is a time of joy. This is the time that the kingdom of God is now here on earth. This is a time where those who have not been able to walk can walk, or the deaf hear, or the blind see. All of these wonderful things. This is not a time for sorrow. This is a time for celebration. But then he goes in and says these words. And notice the parables again. He says in verse 21, no one, okay, he's making it as it's an absurd thing to do. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. For else, if the new piece pulls away from the old, a tear is made worse. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine bursts the wineskins, and the wine is spilled, and the wineskins are ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins. What Jesus is trying to say is that this is something completely different than you have ever experienced. Don't try to fit me in with the John the Baptist. Don't try to fit me in with the Pharisees. Don't try to fit me in with anything else that this world has ever seen, because I break all of those molds. And that's what he ends up doing here in these texts. He breaks the mold on things. Jesus is new. His movement is new and different than everything else. In fact, we've seen Jesus breaks the mold about forgiveness. There in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, you would expect that this man was going to be forgiven, that he would have to go to the temple, he would have to go to the priest, he would have to offer sacrifices for forgiveness. But instead, Jesus breaks all that mold and he says, I'm the one that can give forgiveness. Son, your sins are forgiven. He breaks the mold when it comes to purity. You see, he's gathered around with all those sinners, with all those tax collectors, and people are looking and saying, well, if Jesus gets near those people, then he's going to be defiled and he's going to be a sinner too. No, he breaks the mold because it is not the sinners that are defiling him, but is instead him that is purifying the sinners. He breaks that mold. He also breaks the mold when it comes to fasting. Because those people were fasting with one type of idea. He says, no, I'm not going to follow your same structures. He breaks the mold when it comes to Sabbath. That's going to be the next sets of stories there at the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, where he breaks this idea about what Sabbath is even all about. And he makes the point that just as I am the Lord, the Son of Man, who has the ability to forgive sins, I also am the Lord of Sabbath. And if he is the Lord of Sabbath, then that means he's the same guy that did the Sabbath back in Genesis. So he is God. That's the claim that he is trying to make. But what we see through all of this is that Jesus breaks the mold. He breaks fast, he breaks Sabbath, and he breaks the mold. And he does this and explains this with these two parables. Okay? So let's think about what he's trying to say with these parables. So this parable of the new cloth. If you try to patch an old garment with a new piece of cloth, the garment will be ruined. Even in the text, he says, no one would do this. Because here's the thing that's taking place. Okay, so you have an old piece of fabric. There is a hole in that fabric. There is a rip in that fabric, whatever the case may be. You take a new piece of fabric and you lay it on top of it and you put it there. But the problem with that new piece of fabric is that it has not been shrunk. It has not been weathered like the rest of it. So what's going to happen is you put that new piece of fabric on that patch. And as time goes on, it will shrink, and in the process of shrinking, it will rip an even bigger hole than you had to begin with. So you don't do that. You don't put a new piece of fabric on the old piece of fabric. All right? Then he talks about wineskins. Now, we don't have the same processes and things as things go today, but this was something that was very, very important during their culture. And what he is saying is that you don't put new wine that has not been fermented yet, you don't put it into an old wineskin. Okay, so wineskins are usually made of some type of leather or things like that. And what would happen is that the old one has already been stretched out. The old one is no longer pliable. The old one can, if it is stretched anymore, it will crack. And so you put that new wine into that old wineskin, and what you end up doing is ruining everything. Because now not only does the old wineskin have a rip in it, but now your new wine, it's spilled everywhere. What good does that do? So the point that's trying to be made is it does no good for you to take something that is new and put it on that which is old. It is no good to take something that is new wineskin, and put it into something that is old. If you do that, it is going to end in ruin. That is the point he is trying to make. Now, how do we take that illustration from life that they would all understand, and how does he spiritualize this? How does he bring it to us? And this is the point we want to get to, okay? The point that Jesus is trying to make is that when you are following after him, it is different than just the old way. In fact, following Jesus is not a new patch for your old way of life. That's what we do. Right? We have our way of life. We have what we do. We have the way that we live. And then we come in contact with Jesus and we think, you know what? This Jesus patch is going to really change my life. Because I'm going to put this Jesus patch on me where I have this hole, where I have this tear in my life, where I have this bad thing, and I'm just going to cover it up with Jesus, and then everything is going to be fine. And what Jesus is trying to say is, if you try to patch your life with me, it's going to end in ruin. Because I'm not a patch. I'm not just a new piece of garment that you attach to your old way of living. The same thing when you think about the idea of new wine. Jesus is saying, following me, following after Jesus, is not just new wine that is poured into your old way of living. But again, that's what, maybe you don't think this, but this is what I think. That sometimes that's what I try to do. Is that, okay, well, here's all the things, I have a list of all the things that I like to do in my life. And then I think about, well, I also need to make sure that I have Jesus. So I'm just going to insert Jesus into that. And that's going to make all those things better. Or we think about maybe some unholy things that we are a part of, and then we think about if we attach that which is holy, being Jesus, to it, that suddenly, somehow it makes all those things better. That we can insert, that we can pour into ourselves the way of Jesus while still trying to live our way. And Jesus is making the point. Mark is trying to make the focus that following Jesus is not that. It is not a new patch on your old way of life. It is not new wine put into this old way of living. In fact, this is basically where we are getting to. That following Jesus cannot compromise with the old. It is incompatible and destructive. Following Jesus cannot compromise with that which is old. So the difference is this. There is a lot of us that sometimes as Christians think, I can continue to do what I want to do as long as I attach Jesus to it. And Jesus is saying, not so fast, my friend. That is not what I want you to do. I don't want you to think that you can continue to live your life the way that you want to live, and as long as you put me along with it, that everything is fine. In fact, what he's trying to say is, you cannot follow me and continue to compromise with your old way of living. He is asking for a radical change. He's not asking for you just to do things a little bit differently. He's not, and I think maybe one of the problems is we make Christianity too much like Christianity light. Okay? And this is going to be some things that are perhaps hard to hear, because it's not as exciting as saying, hey, everybody, just come on. No, yes, please, just be okay, just try better, just be a Christian, and those types of things. And definitely we need to realize that He is accepting of anyone and everyone to come in. But when you come in, you leave differently. So many times we think that it's just, okay, well, I have these sins in my life, and now I have this Band-Aid that I call Christ, and I put it over top of it. How many times do you ever see Jesus go up to somebody and give them a Band-Aid? He doesn't. He changes them. He heals them. He doesn't hand the lame man a crutch. He instead says, take up your bed and walk. Right? He doesn't talk to the woman that has a disease and says, here, take 2 of these and call me in the morning. He says that you are healed of those things. It changes their life. And that's what we need to think about Christianity also. If we're talking about a cruciformed life, then that is a life that always goes to the cross. And when you go to the cross, you're going to have to die. We do not like to think about that. But you're going to have to die. I cannot continue to live my life just any old way I want to live it. Just because the same way. It'd be like trying to put a new patch on an old garment or trying to put new wine into an old wineskin. It's going to spill and going to ruin everything. Following after Christ is incompatible with that which is old. Following after Christ means that you have to be new. Notice a couple other passages as we think about this. Over in 2 Corinthians and in chapter 5. Here Paul is having this discussion with a Corinthian church, a church that had many problems, a group of people that he had loved, a group of people that he had cried over, that he had dealt with, that he had worked day in and day out. He knew about them. He knew about their sins. In fact, you can read other times in 1 Corinthians and read about in chapter 6 and all the things that some of them were involved in, right? But the point that Paul was trying to make to them there, and the same point that he's trying to make to them here, is being a Christian does not mean that you are an old creation doing new things. Being a Christian means that you are a new creation. All those other old things, they've been done away with. Look what he says in chapter 5, verse 17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. My problem is that I think that I can continue on in my old creation ways while claiming to be about the new creation. That's not the way it should be. That leads in ruin. That is a falsehood. That is a farce. That is a sad way to go about it, just thinking that as long as I claim Christ and I don't have to change anything, that everything's going to be okay. No, a new creation. Old things have passed away. Or how about the way Paul put it over in Romans in chapter 12, right? So after Paul, the first 11 chapters, he's been giving this great sermon, this very deep theological study about how that the Lord has brought about salvation. He refers to it as the righteousness of God. And then in chapter 12, he starts more of the application process of it. And he starts there in verse 1. He says, therefore I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present yourselves as a living sacrifice. Guess what sacrifices do? They die. And that's the problem, some commentators have said, about a living sacrifice, is they keep crawling off the altar. But that's what we are called to be. We're living, but we're dead. We're dead to what? Well, he said it in chapter 6. You're dead to that old way of life. That way you can live a new life. But look what he says here in chapter 12 and verse 2. He says, and do not be conformed to this world. Just to rephrase that a little bit, what I try to do is I try to take Christianity and I try to conform it to my life. Sometimes we try to take Christ, that new patch, that new wine, and we try to fit it in to our old way of living. Do not be conformed to this world. But he says instead, be transformed. That's not taking something that is old and just putting a new patch on it. That is taking something and radically changing it into something totally different. And that something totally different is Jesus Christ. And that is the way, at the point that perhaps he is trying to make. Transformed by the renewing of your mind that you may prove that which is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So this morning, as you come together, right, as we are here and as we are thinking about these texts, and I want you also to think about your life. I'm going to give you a hint. I'm going to give you a secret. The same secret that Jesus is trying to point out. If you are trying to live your life and using Jesus just as a new patch or just as new wine and continuing on in your old way of living, it ends in ruin. It's sad. You may think, oh, this is what I need to do. You are fooling yourself. Let me speak from experience. When I just try to put a Christian patch on sinful living, it does not help. It doesn't help. But instead, what he is calling for is a radical transformation. Something that is totally brand new. Something, yes, you came into this life. You came into this relationship with Jesus as a sinner. This, as we talked about from chapter 2 and that first story, right? You came down into the room being lame and a sinner, but you walk out being saved and walking. What we try to do is we try to use Jesus as a crutch instead of using Jesus as a transformation to a new life. Stop doing that. Stop using Christ as a Band-Aid. Stop using Christ as just a new cloth on an old piece of garment. Instead, make the whole garment brand new. And I am so thankful that Jesus has the power to do that. It's not because you're great. It's not because of your righteousness. It's not because you have done all the things that you think that you need to do. It is because Jesus has a transforming power by His blood to cleanse you. How much? To cleanse you fully. How much sin has gone away? All the sin has gone away. How much of a new creature are you? You are a completely new creature. How much has passed away? All that is old has passed away. So that you can live that new life. Over in Romans and in chapter 6, that's the point that Paul is trying to make too. He recalls them back to a historical situation in each and every one of their lives. You see, Paul is writing to Christians. And so in writing to Christians, he wants them to recall to their mind the historical moment in time when all the old things died and all the new things came to life. And that was their baptism. He is reminding them that they have a Jesus who died and how that they too have died. They died with Jesus to their sin. And so the point he's trying to make is, why are you continuing in sin then? Because you died to it. Why are you continuing to try to put Jesus into your old wineskin of life? Because you're supposed to be a new wineskin, to have this new wine. So, what does this question have to do with fasting? It doesn't. It has to do with trying to fit in. And if you are trying to fit Jesus in to your way of life, you are going about it all wrong. Don't try to fit Jesus into your life. Instead, let Jesus, who is your life, make everything fit. Right? Instead of being something that is that new patch on the old garment, make a new garment with Christ. Instead of being that new wine that has gone into the old wineskin, be new wineskin. And that is what we have the opportunity to do this morning. That's why we have baptism. Because in baptism, we actually see that taking place, right? We actually see someone dying, being buried. What do you bury? Do you bury people that are alive or people that are dead? You bury dead people. So be dead to your sin, bury it, and then rise again. This time not to live your life, but to live His life. A life that is shaped by the cross. If there's anything to help you this morning, please come as we stand and sing.